All right, another huge thing to consider when we're looking at our turrets on our scope is the range of overall adjustment, particularly in the elevation range. How much adjustment can you get out of your scope? You want to make sure that your scope has enough adjustment in it to where you can actually get out as far as you need to go. For example, if you're shooting at really, really far distances, you might run out of elevation. You might crank or you might max it all the way out and, don't have enough elevation setting there. And that's not a good deal. There are ways to get around that. You can go with scope bases that are angled scope bases, like instead of a lot of scope bases that you mount the rings on. The base is the part that screws to the rifle, and then you put your rings on that. But parallel scope bases are just basically parallel with the bore. For long-range applications, most guys like to use tapered scope bases, and they usually have them in 10 minute of angle, 20 minute of angle, or 30 minute of angle taper. So basically, it kind of ramps up the back of your scope. It tilts it forward a little bit to kind of give you more adjustment range in your elevation. So you're already kind of you basically add like 10 or 20 or 30 minutes of elevation to your scope just by having that tapered scope base. So some rifles, though, however, you're not going to have the option of having a tapered scope base. Like, for example, in a Ruger M77, where it has integral scope mounts for the rings, okay? The rings are just bolting straight onto there's no scope base, really. It's just an integral mount. So you can't put a taper on there. Now, they do have bases that you can buy for those, but you don't want a lot of moving parts. So in the case of a M77, in a Ruger, you will need a scope with an adequate amount of range of adjustment, particularly in the elevation range if you're going to want to be shooting very far. For example, in a 300 Winchester Magnum, standard atmosphere, a typical firing solution at 1,000 yards is going to be like 27.7, 28 minutes of angle. So you're going to want to make sure that your scope has at least 60 minutes of angle total elevation, at least 60, because you're going to assume that you're going to start off in the middle of your adjustment range, okay? And then you're going to have 30 one way and 30 one way. So you're going to have 30 up and 30 down. So if you don't have a taper on your scope base, you're going to want to be able to make sure that you have enough elevation range inside the scope to make up for that. So if you had a scope with 60 minutes of overall travel, that'll get you 30 minutes of elevation. You take that and basically divide it in half. That's the usable elevation you're most likely going to have. Now, you do want to err on the side of more range of adjustment, because sometimes everything isn't lined up and you might minus some off of there, and that's not going to be good for you either. So the more range of adjustment, the better you're going to be, and the longer you're going to be able to shoot, because the farther you go, obviously, the more elevation you're going to have to index on your optic. So typically, let's look at like a Leupold Stevens M1, like the Leupold Mark IV type scopes. In a 10 power scope, like a straight 10 Leupold, you're going to have about 90 minutes of angle of total elevation. So that's about 45 minutes of real elevation. Unless you get a tapered scope base, then you can add a few onto there. You know, add 15, add 20 minutes or whatever. In the 16 power Leupold Stevens M1 scope, they have 150 minutes of angle. Now, the different minutes of angle really has to do with the erector travel. And if you look at the picture of the scope here, we talked about how the turret presses against the erector assembly. Now, when you turn that screw, that erector assembly moves back and forth. Now, this is dependent on tube diameter, okay? Now, the tube in which your erector assembly, that portion we talked about, is sitting inside, a larger tube is going to have more possible range of adjustment. If you have a skinny tube, it's only going to be able to go up and down so far when you turn your screws, your elevation knobs, right? So if you have a larger tube, you're going to have a lot more range of adjustment. So that's why 30 millimeter scopes are superior to 1-inch scopes, and that's why 35 millimeter scopes are superior to 30 millimeter scopes. The larger your tube diameter, the more range of adjustment you're going to have, and range of adjustment is your friend. You're going to want the more you can get, the better, especially if you're trying to shoot at extreme ranges. Now, if you got a 308 or something like that, where your max effective range, you got to consider your cartridge. If your max effective range is only really maybe 1,000 meters pushing it, and all you need is like 40 or so minutes of angle or whatever your firing solution would be, then, you know, that's as much as you're going to need. But on some of these cartridges, you're going to be able to push it out 1,700 meters, you know, maybe 2,000 on some of these. So you're going to need to make sure that your range of adjustment in your particular optic you get is going to be adequate for the cartridge you're shooting with the load combination. And you always want to err on the side of caution again. Make sure that you calculate your firing solution at your max effective range in the thickest possible air conditions that you would have. And we'll talk about this more in our video about advanced external ballistics. But, you know, pick like a cold day when the air's the thickest, it's going to have the most drag on your bullet. What's the maximum possible elevation setting you would ever need to dial in on your scope for your cartridge? And then make sure you have a scope that is suitable for that. If you look at, let's see, like the USO, that's US Optics. It's kind of a proprietary optics company. We'll talk about that more in the next video here. If you look at their SN3 scope, they have a lot of elevation adjustment. They're really good. They have like 160 to 180 minutes of angle. So the USO is a very good choice. The Schmidt & Bender PM2 has like, this one's in radians, so this has 0 to 26 milliradians. And 26 milliradians is going to get you pretty far. That'll get you pretty much as far as you're going to need to go. It's like 64 minutes of angle in the minutes version. So that's enough. One of the more affordable optics that's out there is the SWFA Super Sniper. In the 10 power Super Sniper, it has 120 minutes of elevation. So that would give you, even like if you didn't have a tapered scope base, 120 minutes is kind of a lot. So you have 60 in each direction. So you can have your elevation set at 60 minutes of angle. That's going to get you probably way farther you're ever going to shoot. So the more range of adjustment you have on your optic, the better. Usually 90 or even 60 is adequate for most purposes, you know, but the more the merrier, especially if you're trying to shoot far. So what you want to do with this whole range of adjustment thing is basically look at your cartridge that you're going to shoot, figure out the maximum possible holdover at the longest distance you're ever going to shoot, and then find a scope that has twice that amount. Unless you can find a rifle with tapered scope bases, then you can add that to your elevation range. Okay, let's look at another important thing you're going to have to consider with your turrets is how many units of elevation are you going to have per revolution. So every time you turn that turret 360 degrees, how many units is it actually going to travel? Now, if you let's look at some examples here, like a Leopold Mark IV, they have 15 minutes per turn. So 15 minutes of elevation per turn. So to get to 1,000 on most stuff, you're going to have to turn it 2 complete revolutions to get to 1,000 meters, okay? So you got to keep that in mind. Let's look at some of the Night Forces scopes. They have 20 minutes per turn on their high-speed scopes, and the Night Force without the high-speed feature is 10 minutes of angle per revolution. So that means every time you turn the knob 360 degrees, you only moved 10 minutes of angle. So on this model, with the 10 minutes per revolution to get to 1,000 meters, you're going to have to turn it 3 times, okay? Because you have less revolutions or less units per revolution. The M3A scope, that's the U.S. Army sniper scope on the M24. That is all of your revolution in the whole scope is basically in one single turn. So that's a single turn knob. So from 0 to 800, you're going to get up to your maximum range for your 308 that's indexed on your M3A, and you're going to get it in one turn. Same is true with this US Optics SN3 or any of their other, they have fixed power scopes as well, like the ST10. But this is equipped with what's called an Eric knob. Now, where this comes important is like when you start getting out there and you start doing this long-range shooting, right? And you're dialing within the range of adjustment for like let's say you have a scope that has 15 minutes of elevation per turn. So your numbers go 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 15, and then it repeats. Most of these scopes are kind of confusing because after 15 minutes of angle, you have to start adding, okay? So 15 plus 1, plus 2, plus 3, plus 4. So if you want 23 minutes of angle, once you get up to 15, you have to say, okay, 15, and then you got to count again, 16, 17, 18, and you got to get up to whatever your firing solution is going to be. If you have to turn this thing 2 or 3 times to get up to some of these really far, these long distance firing solutions, you might get lost in there someplace, and you might forget where you're at. And when you're trying to return the scope back down to 0, some of these are not equipped with 0 stops, which means that when you turn it back down to wherever you're zeroed for 100 meters or whatever, you're going to turn the scope back down. You might oh man, did I have this turned 3 times or twice or what? And then especially if you bug out of your position in a quick fashion and you get back to the vehicle or you get back, and you're looking at your weapon, you're like, oh man, I forgot to, return to 0. Well, you're out of the field now. You might forget where it was at. So what'll happen a lot of times, unfortunately, is these scopes with the range of adjustment that's not a lot. Like if you only have 15 minutes of adjustment and you had to turn it like twice, you might return it to 0 and you think you're at 0, but you're really at 15 because you turned it twice. So the next time you go out, all right, you figure out a new firing solution, you go out, you lay down, and you start shooting, and you have no idea where you're hitting. You're like, oh man, and then your spotter notices you're way, way over the top. You're shooting like hundreds of meters past the target. Well, how did that happen? Well, you got lost in your range of adjustment because you only returned it to 15 degrees the day before. So if you do have a scope that has only 15 minutes of angle, for example, per revolution, I would strongly recommend there's hash marks on the turret. When you're turning it, I would get like a Sharpie, a silver-colored Sharpie or something light, or some paint, and I would definitely mark off where your 0 is at on the scope, or carve it in there, make a scratch or something, but mark down on that optic where your 0 is, so that when you're returning the optic back to 0, you can crank it back down. That's probably the best way to fix that problem. And scopes with 0 stop adjustments, that's a mechanical deal that bottoms out. So when you go back down and you hit 0, there's a big stop in there that stops you from going any further down. That's another good feature to have on your turrets. Now, what I prefer the most when we're talking about range of adjustment is I like to have as much range of adjustment as possible in the least amount of turns, for the very reasons we just talked about. I don't like being confused in the field. And when I was training up on these rifles here, the one I was using had 15 minutes per turn. And that will happen sometimes. You will get lost in the turns, and that's not good. That can make for a terrible miss, and it's quite embarrassing. So the more simple you can make it by your optic selection, there are optics out there that do have more range of adjustment for given turns, okay? So like if you're, for example, looking at a Night Force scope, a lot of these guys really like the Night Force scope. So one of the downfalls of a lot of the Night Force models is they only have 10 minutes of adjustment per every revolution. So it's easy to get lost in there, and it's hard to keep track of where you're at sometimes. So if you can get one of the high-speed ones, that might be desirable, possibly with the 20 minutes per turn, although 20 is not really an even number like 10 is. So it depends on what makes most sense to you. The Schmidt & Bender PM2, this is what I have on my 338. This is a double turn knob, so it has all my elevation just in 2 turns. But it has different colored numbers. One color is white and one color is yellow, so that when I'm in my second revolution, there's little windows on the turret that light up, okay? And it's like a mechanical deal that puts little yellow flags in these windows. And that lets me know that, okay, now I'm in my second revolution, and then I look at the yellow numbers so I can see where I'm at in my rotation. But that's kind of a fail-safe way of not getting lost, so that you can just take a glance over at your scope, and your spotter's going to be watching you too. He's going to want to be able to look at your knob and see exactly where you're indexed before he gives you a green light to shoot. That's a lot more difficult with these scopes with multiple turns to get the same units, dialed in. So the more adjustment you can have and the least amount of turns, the better. PM2 is pretty good, but those are pretty pricey optics. If you have to go with one of these other ones that's in 15-minute increments, there are some now that have some pretty good features, like they will have the other numbers carved into the turrets now, and I think, they're getting smarter with their scope design. So some of these optics, like I think I got a picture of one here, this has one set of numbers, that's for your first revolution. The second set of numbers above that, that's for your second set, because you can, when you're excited in the field, one thing is, that's not hard to add, but when you're excited in the field and you're trying to compensate for a whole host of things, and you're trying to keep track of everything, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And the more simple you can keep it, the better off you're going to be. So if you're stuck with a scope that only has 15 minutes of angle per turn or 10 minutes of angle per turn, and it's not already marked off so you can read it, you can draw it out on a piece of paper. I've done that, and then you can tape on your own numbers, or you can even take it to an engraver or something and have them hey, carve some numbers above here, so that you don't have to keep track as much, and that'll save you some headache. Okay, so that's the turrets. Number 1, absolutely crucial that the tracking on your turrets is 100% reliable all the time. You want it to move exactly by the amount you dialed it in. We talked about range of adjustment, your elevation range. You want to make sure that the scope you pick out has enough elevation range to compensate for your trajectory. So if you're shooting at a really long distance and you got a lot of elevation you're going to have to index, you want to make sure that your scope has enough travel of adjustment on the inside. And basically larger tube diameters will give you more. And you would have to contact the manufacturer if they didn't advertise what that range of adjustment is, but you can write them a letter, email them, or maybe do a search and find out for whatever particular model you're looking at, what is the range of adjustment on that scope, and then make sure you have enough room there. We also talked about units per revolution. That's not near as important as these other two things like tracking and range of adjustment, but it will save you quite a bit of a headache if you can get a lot more units of travel per revolution. So the less you have to crank that thing in circles, the better off you're going to be. Okay, that was the first sight parameter. That was turrets. Let's talk about tube diameter. We already briefly covered it a little bit. I want to reiterate the fact here that the larger diameter tubes are going to be better because erector travel is dependent on tube diameter. And when we're talking about erector travel, that's how much your erector assembly is movable. So that's directly correlates with your range of adjustment. So the bigger your tube is, the more range of adjustment you're going to have, okay? So that's, when we're looking at tube diameter, that's the primary advantage of a 30 millimeter scope over a 1-inch scope, which is 25.4 millimeters. Or a 34 millimeter scope will, generally speaking, have more erector travel than a 30. Another thing about tube diameter is there's a thing, an effect called optical vignetting. Okay? Now, optical vignetting is basically a reduction of an image's brightness or saturation at the periphery of the image compared to the center of the image. Okay? So if you are maxed out, let's say that you're dialed in all the way to the top. You're shooting really far. Let's say your total range of adjustment in your scope is only 60 minutes, total range of adjustment, okay? And you're using 30 of those, okay? And you don't have a tapered base, so you're all the way on the far edge of the lens. So you've got it cranked up to 30 minutes, so your scope is basically bottomed out. You got the elevation dial cranked all the way over. What you have is, when you're in this situation, when you're at the far periphery of the lens, is optical vignetting. And when they carve these lenses down, as you get towards the periphery of the lenses, the edges, it becomes a lot more difficult for the lens manufacturers to get everything squared away perfectly towards the edge. So what you'll have is vignetting, which is either like an optical distortion towards the edge of the lens, which can result in potential point of impact differences. And a lot of optics, just because it's hard towards the edge of the lens to get everything perfect, when you're maxed out at the very, very ends of your elevation setting or your windage settings, like if you've got your elevation cranked all the way, you're basically, their crosshairs is looking through just the outer periphery of the lens, optical vignetting is going to distort that slightly, okay? And it will either, if you don't notice it, it will throw you off a little bit. So that can potentially change your point of impact when you're maxed out. So the more tube diameter you have, the larger your tube diameter, the less likely you are going to have to worry about optical vignetting, because your range of adjustment is going to be larger. So even when you're shooting at your max range, like let's say you're shooting 1,400 meters or something, you're still going to have some room between the periphery of the lens and the center. So you're like not all the way towards the edge of the lens when you're maxed out on your elevation setting, because you gave yourself some wiggle room. So that's one important thing about tube diameter is you want to have more range of adjustment if you can help it. Just because you might be able to squeeze it in there doesn't mean you should. So it is desirable to have even more range of adjustment, even though you might not need it, just because of the optical vignetting. So the more range of adjustment you can have, the merrier, okay? All right, so that was tube diameter. The next topic of discussion here is magnification.